on this, there is then a roughened area, and that roughened area then is the deltoid tuberosity, and the deltoid tuberosity then is for the attachment then of the deltoid muscle. On the distal end, which is the distal epiphysis, there's all kinds of different structures on the distal epiphysis. Okay, on the distal lateral side is then the capitulum, and this capitulum then ties into the head of the radius. And when the radius bone is flexed, it will run into a fossa right here, which then is called a radial fossa, and that prevents the radial bone from being flexed too far. Okay, on the medial side is the trochlea, and this is the distal medial side, and then this then is for the connection of the ulna, which then is on the little finger side of the forearm. And again, when this is flexed, it has a fossa, which then is called a coronoid fossa, and that's going to fit into the coronoid of the ulna, will fit into that fossa. Again, many points of attachment, and on the medial side there's a medial projection, which is quite large, which is the medial epicondyle, and then on the lateral side, which isn't quite as sharp, is then the lateral epicondyle, and those then are points of attachment for the tendons that are running then to the muscles of the forearm. On the posterior side now then is going to be the olecranon fossa, and that then is going to be for the olecranon, which is this projection on the ulna, is going to fit. So it's going to slide in here and it's going to fit like that, and that's going to be that fossa. The ulna then excuse me, is this forearm bone, and this then will be on the little finger side, and this then is the bone which we use then to flex the forearm against the humerus. Okay, on the proximal end there is an anterior projection, which then is called the coronoid fossa, or coronoid process, I should say. And so this is the anterior projection on the proximal end. Now they will form a notch, which is then called the trochlear notch, and this then is going to tie into the trochlea of the humerus. Now also on this end there is going to be another notch, which is the radial notch, and this then is going to be for the head of the radius. Now on the ulna, the distal end is called a head, so this distal end is the head, and there is a projection that projects then medially, and that then is a styloid process, and so that's on the distal end, sitting somewhat posteriorly. The other forearm bone then is the radius, and the radius then is on the thumb side of the forearm. Okay, and the head of the radius then is on the proximal end, and the head then is rounded. Also, there is a radial tuberosity, which is this roughened surface area right here, and about an inch down from the head, and this then is for attachment of the bicep muscle. There is also a projection off the radius on the lateral side, and that projection then is the styloid process, and the two styloid processes will help form the wrist joint. Now also on the medial side of the radius there is a depression, and that then is the ulnar notch, and that then is for the head of the ulna to fit in. The wrist bones then are the carpals, and so we have these series of carpals that make up the wrist bones. Okay, and on the proximal row, on the thumb side, which will be the lateral side, the first wrist bone then would be the scaphoid, and the scaphoid then resembles a boat. The next one, going from lateral to medial, will be the lunate, and the lunate resembles that like of a crescent moon. Okay, on the little finger side now, there are two bones kind of sitting one on top of the other. The lower one then is then the triquetral, which means it has three articular surfaces. And sitting on top of it then is a little tiny bone, which is a P shape, which is called a pisiform. So these then are the proximal row going from lateral to medial. Now the distal row also now going from lateral to medial. The first one then is the trapezium, and the trapezium is tying into the thumb. So this first one here tying into the thumb is the trapezium. The next one then is the trapezoid, and the trapezoid then is tying into the into the index finger. The large one then is the capitate, and the capitate then is tying into the middle finger. And the last one is then the hamate, and the hamate has a hook on it, and the hamate then ties into the ring finger and into the little finger. So these then are the carpal bones. These then gives us movements in multiple directions. The hand bones then are the metacarpals, and they are numbered from Roman numeral 1 to Roman numeral 5, going then from the thumb then to the little finger. And they all consist then of the proximal base, the shaft then, and the distal head. So that repeats itself. The proximal base, the shaft, distal head. The phalanges then are the fingers, and they are typically three rows. There's the proximal row, the middle row, and the distal row. The exception is the thumb, which is also called a pollex, and the thumb just has the proximal row and the proximal bone and distal bone. Okay, that finishes up the hand and the arm, and the next part then will be going into the pelvic girdle. And so we're going to use the book a little bit on the pelvic girdle and show a little bit. But the pelvic girdle then consists of two bones, and these bones then are the coxal bones. And each coxal bone consists of three different regions. The upper region of the coxal bone then is the ilium. The posterior inferior region then is the ischium, and the anterior inferior area then is the pubic. So the three regions then of a coxal bone are the ilium, ischium, and pubis. Okay, now between the bones, and here's where the book comes in, is that there is a pubic symphysis, and that's a fibrocartilage that is connecting to two coxal bones on the anterior side. Now there is an imaginary brim right about here, and that is then called the brim of the pelvis. And the area above that brim then is what is called the greater or the true pelvis, and that would be where the lower body organs are, such as the uterus, the fallopian tubes, and probably the lower part of our intestines. As we go below the brim, that is called the lesser or the true pelvis, and that would be where the vaginal canal or the birth canal and the lower part of our rectum is coming out then through the lesser or the true pelvis. When a person is giving birth, the pelvic inlet is the movement going from superior to inferior, going into the brim from the superior direction, pelvic outlet then would be where it is coming from the brim and then exiting the body. And so those are the pelvic inlet, and then below it then would be the pelvic outlet. The ilium is this upper superior portion, is the ilium, and that's the big flat portion of the coxa bone. The very top of the ilium then is the iliac crest. Now we end up with two major spines. The anterior spine, which is quite sharp, is the anterior superior iliac spine. On the posterior side is then the posterior superior iliac spine. And these are both guideposts when a person is doing massage therapy to know where they're at. Now, on the posterior surface, there is a very distinct notch, which then is called the greater sciatic notch. And so then we end up with a sciatic nerve, which is a major nerve going down the posterior part of the leg, coming out through that greater sciatic notch. On the medial surface of the ilium is a depression, which then is called the iliac fossa. Also, the ilium then is going to tie into the sacrum, and the sacrum then is the lower part of our vertebral column. And so we have a sacrum like this that's going to tie in, and that roughened surface where it ties into the sacrum is the auricular surface, and when it ties in it forms a joint, which is the sacroiliac joint. That's the type, those two together. So you got the auricular surface and the sacroiliac joint. Now this posterior inferior portion of the coxa bone then is the ischium, and this is what we end up sitting on when we are sitting down physically. Okay, and then extending posterior then is the ischial spine, and the ischial spine then is right below the greater sciatic notch, and so it's a sharp spine below it. And then below the iliac spine then it's a smaller notch, which is called a lesser sciatic notch. Now we have a very large opening, a foramen opening between the ischium and the pubic, which is called the obturator foramen, and it's made up of three different rami or ramuses, and the one that's projecting anterior, so this is the ramus of the ischium, and it's projecting anteriorly from the body of the ischium. So this right through here then is the ramus of the ischium. Now the bone in the front of the coxa bone then is the pubic bone, or the pubis. This then is our keystone bone. This is a very major bone so far as maintaining our balance and our equilibrium. And they have two ramus or rami that are making up the obturator foramen. So this projecting posteriorly from the body of the pubic bone is the superior ramus, and then also projecting posteriorly inferiorly from the body is the inferior ramus. So you have three rami, the rami of the ischium and the inferior superior rami of the pubic bone, forming this large opening which is called the obturator foramen. Now the superior portion of the pubic bone is a little bit sharp, and that then is the pubic crest. And then going out laterally from the body then is a projection, point of attachment for a lot of adductor muscles of the legs, and this then is the pubic tubercle. The whole central area of the pubic bone then would be considered to be the body of the pubic bone. Okay. Now, also here in the coxa bone, which is kind of in between all three of the bones, is this large socket, which is the acetabulum, and the acetabulum then is for the head of the femur. So the head of the femur is going to fit into that acetabulum. So that's a huge, big socket for the head of the femur. Our femur now is our longest bone of the body. This is the major bone that determines our height, and so it's also considered one of our strongest bones of our body. Okay, so this is our upper leg bone, and the different parts of this upper leg bone then would be the head, and this would be on the on the proximal medial side of the femur. So this then is the head of the femur. Now the constricted area right behind it then is the neck of the femur. And so when a person breaks their hip, actually what they are doing is they're breaking the neck of the femur. Now there is a large lateral projection, and that is the greater trochanter. And so we have so many powerful muscles that are holding the hip bones together that needs to be a lot of space for a lot of points of attachment. So this was then the greater trochanter, and then posterior and inferior to the greater trochanter then is then the inferior, or the lesser trochanter. Lesser trochanter's proper name. Now also when we go down the posterior surface, there is this roughened line or linea, and that then is for the point of attachment for the hamstrings muscles running down the posterior side. Now as we go down to the distal epiphysis, we have these rounded ends, and so this one on the outside now would be the lateral condyle, and then on the opposite side, on the medial side, is the medial condyle. So these are the rounded ends of the distal end of the femur. Now the areas right above it are for attachments of ligaments, and so now this end would be the lateral epicondyle, which is for a ligament to go down to the tibia, and on the other side would be the medial epicondyle. Now in between the two condyles then is a very distinct depression, and that is the intercondylar fossa, and that's where the anterior cruciate ligament and the posterior cruciate ligament lie. On the anterior surface of the distal end of the femur then is the patellar surface, and that then is for the patella to slide up and down. And we don't have a patella. So, can you stop that a minute?
Yes.